Hey guys, here is the overview video of chapter 21 about the evolution of populations. So just a reminder that organisms cannot evolve during their lifetime. So the smallest unit of evolution is on population. So only populations evolve. Natural selection does act on individuals, but again, those individuals themselves cannot evolve, only the population. So a population of ground finches on an island during a drought, the large beaked birds were more likely to crack large seeds and survive. So the finch population evolved by natural selection to have larger beaks. So you can see from 1976 just to 1978, so 2 years, you can see the average beak size increased. So microevolution is what we were talking about with the example of the finches, is a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. And 3 mechanisms cause allele frequencies to change. Natural selection is one of them, so that's what our focus has been on so far. There's also genetic drift and gene flow. So those are the other 2 that we're going to focus on during this chapter. Only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. So variation in heritable traits is a prerequisite for evolution. What that means again is those traits that are passed on from parents to offspring, that natural variation that occurs originally due to mutation, that is what's needed for evolution to occur, right? If everything is exactly the same, there's nothing that can change, right? There's no variation there. All right, so phenotypic variation often reflects genetic variation. So that phenotypic variation is what evolution acts on. So the physical traits. All right, and some of those phenotypic differences are due to just differences in a single gene. Some differences are due to many genes working together. And let's see, phenotype is the product of inherited genotype and environment. So it's both of those together. So I'm sure you guys have heard about nature, nurture before, this happens with phenotypes as well. So there is a component of both that impacts phenotype. So, and then again, natural selection can only act on phenotypic variation that has a genetic component. So here you can see these caterpillars raised on a diet of oak flowers. They look, I don't know, almost a little bit fuzzy or furry. And then here's caterpillars raised on a diet of oak leaves. So you can see the difference there. This is just due to environment. All right, sources of genetic variation. So new genes and alleles can arise by mutation or gene duplication. Only a mutation in cells that produce gametes can be passed on to offspring. So that's really important. Only a mutation in cells that produce gametes. So only a mutation that occurs in cells that are going to undergo meiosis can be passed on to offspring. So effects of point mutations can vary. So remember, a point mutation is a change in one base. Those mutations can be neutral, so it might not have a cause. It could be harmful. So if the mutation alters the phenotype, it could be harmful, but it could also be beneficial. Mutation rates are pretty low in animals and plants. The average is about 1 mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation. Mutation rates are often lower in prokaryotes and higher in viruses, but those short generation times allow mutations to accumulate rapidly in prokaryotes and viruses. In organisms that reproduce sexually, most genetic variation results from the recombination of alleles. So if you guys remember back to meiosis and us talking about genetic variation and talking about recombination, that happened due to independent assortment and crossing over. Fertilization creates genetic diversity as well, or genetic variation. All right, so if we are trying to figure out if a population is evolving, we're going to use the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So there is a whole separate Edpuzzle just focusing on Hardy-Weinberg, and because you do need to be able to solve problems with this equation. I'm just going to kind of go through the theory of it in this video, but not really focus on the equation. So the first step in testing whether evolution is occurring in a population is to clarify what we mean by a population. So a population is a localized group of individuals capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. A gene pool consists of all the alleles for all the loci in that population. And an allele for a particular locus is fixed if all individuals in a population are homozygous for the same allele. So if every individual is homozygous recessive for the same allele, that allele is fixed. So you can see here, there's two different herds. This would be two different populations of, I can't even tell what those are, elk maybe. Oh yeah, it's in Alaska and Canada. So elk. All right, so there's a difference. So we can be talking about evolution, right? We can be talking about changes in a population, or we can be talking about genetic equilibrium. So genetic equilibrium is when allele frequencies stay the same in a population. And if those allele frequencies don't change, the population is not evolving. So genetic equilibrium, a population is not evolving. Are there non-evolving populations in nature? Probably not, right? I cannot think of a single population, and we'll look at what is required for a population to be in genetic equilibrium, and that would be really, really hard to do in a natural setting, so in nature. So we're going to talk about what's required to maintain genetic variation and then what Hardy-Weinberg is. So another definition for evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population. So we might not be talking about a whole new species evolving. We might just be talking about a change in allele frequencies. So more about microevolution. So what conditions would cause allele frequencies not to change? A non-evolving population, this is what fulfills Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So we have to remove all agents of evolutionary change. So in order for genetic equilibrium to exist or for a population not to evolve, these 5 conditions need to be met. One is it has to be a very large population so that genetic drift cannot happen. And we'll talk about what genetic drift is in a little bit. Second one is no natural selection can occur. Everyone is equally fit. There's no adaptations to the environment. Number 3, no mutations are occurring. So there's no genetic change. There's no variation. And then number 4, random mating happens. So there's no sexual selection. There's no preference in mating. It's just completely random. And then number 5, no migration. So no individuals coming in or out of the population. So there's no gene flow. And again, we'll talk about more about gene flow in a little bit. So really, Hardy-Weinberg is not going to happen in nature. It's really hypothetical. It's non-evolving, and it serves kind of as a null hypothesis, right? So we can use this to determine if a population is evolving. So this is our null hypothesis. It's a useful model to measure if forces are acting on a population, and it measures evolutionary change. And you can see there's a picture of Hardy and Weinberg. So they work together to develop this hypothesis and the equation. All right, so in that Hardy-Weinberg principle or equation, the original proportions of genotypes are going to remain constant from generation to generation. So the frequencies of those alleles in a population stay the same from generation to generation unless acted upon by chance, natural selection, or other factors. All right, so this is really important. So sexual shuffling of genes, which happens in meiosis and fertilization, will not change allelic proportions. So if we're just mixing up the alleles in the population, the frequency of those alleles is not going to change. We're just going to kind of have, instead of having, let's say we had a homozygous dominant parent, a homozygous recessive parent, they created heterozygous offspring. We still have the same alleles, right? They're just shuffled differently. So keep that in mind. All right. We're going to keep going here. I think I already talked about all of this. Yep, we already talked about all those. So 5 conditions. So make sure you're remembering those 5 conditions that are necessary for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to exist or for genetic equilibrium to exist. in a population. So 3 factors alter allele frequencies. So we talked about those earlier. So we're going to kind of go through and explain. You guys already know your masters at natural selection. So that's the first one. And then we're going to talk about genetic drift and gene flow. So again, natural selection is that there's differential success in reproduction that results in certain alleles being passed to the next generation in greater proportion. All right. Genetic drift. So genetic drift is completely due to chance. So I think of this as if you're drifting along, if you're stranded at sea, you're on a raft, you're just drifting, right? Where you go, it's just due to chance. So this is changes in allele frequencies of a gene pool due to chance. This has a larger effect in a small population. So let's say I have this population of frogs living in my little window well to my basement. It rains a ton, and these frogs are able to climb up on a little ledge. These ones aren't. Just by chance, right? This is completely by chance. This is just some random event. A lot of times this could be a natural disaster, something that there's no selection whatsoever happening, completely by chance. Let's say, though, by chance, all of these frogs die off, all of these red frogs. Now, because of genetic drift, our resulting population is going to look different. So the smaller the sample, the more likely it is that the chance alone will cause deviation. So genetic drift describes how allele frequencies fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. All right, there's 2 types of genetic drift. One is founder effect. So in here, an original population is composed of a variety of phenotypes. So you can see here's our original population, variety of phenotypes. Let's say this big group, we have 2 groups that then go off and found their own populations. So founding population A is just made up of these yellow and black beetles. So their descendants, or this resulting generation, is not going to look the same as the original population. Same thing here. If these yellow and red beetles go off and create their own population, they are going to look different as well. So founder effect, I think of like founding fathers. So it is any organisms that go off and kind of create their own colony or population. And because it's a small group, their resulting population is going to look different than the original population. All right, so in founder effects, sometimes rare alleles occur at a higher frequency because those alleles carried by the population founders are dictated by chance. So an example of this is polydactyly, or having an extra digit. So poly, many, dactyl is digit. And then, so this, you can see this child has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fingers. Polydactyly is actually dominant. It's a dominant trait, which is kind of interesting. But this is a more common in certain religious sects that were founded by a small number of individuals. I don't want to say, I'm like blanking on the religion, so I don't want to give inaccurate results. But if you want to research, just write polydactyly inheritance in religious groups, and you'll come up with the whole story there. All right, so the other type of genetic drift is bottleneck effect. So this is an event prevents a majority of genotypes from entering the next generation, and then few individuals actually participate in reproduction. So this has happened when species almost go extinct, when they're endangered. The population gets so small, we only have a few individuals to repopulate. So few individuals actually participate in reproduction, and you can think of this like, that's why it's called a bottleneck. So we have our original population here. You can see there's diversity. And then here's the bottlenecking event. So for some reason, this could be something happens like just mass killing, and we have this bottlenecking effect. And then you can see the surviving population does not have some of that diversity. And then all of these organisms are the only organisms left to repopulate. So not a lot of genetic diversity at all. So loss of prairie habitat, this is just an example, caused severe reduction in the population of greater prairie chickens in Illinois. The surviving birds had low levels of genetic variation and only 50% of their eggs hatched. So here's this greater prairie chicken. I've never seen one. So you can see in 1820, there were these greater prairie chickens all over the US. In 1993, you can see there's just a few populations in southern Illinois. So a summary of genetic drift. It's significant in small populations. It can cause allele frequencies to change at random. It leads to a loss of genetic variation, and it can cause harmful alleles to become fixed. So if that is the only allele that is in the population, that's the only allele that can be inherited. And again, two types of genetic drift, founder effect and bottleneck. All right, moving on to gene flow. So think of this as a flow, right? Flow in and out. So a flow consists of the movement of alleles among a population. They can be transferred through the movement of fertile individuals or gametes. So you can think of pollen, you can think of immigration. Gene flow tends to reduce genetic variation among populations over time. So gene flow can decrease the fitness of a population. Immigration of birds from the mainland introduce alleles that decrease the fitness. And then natural selection reduces the frequency of these alleles where immigration is low. So in the central population, high immigration from the mainland overwhelms the effects of selection. All right, gene flow is an important agent of evolutionary change in human population. So gene flow can increase the fitness of a population. It just kind of depends. So insecticides, the spreader alleles were resistant to insecticides. They've been used to target mosquitoes, and alleles have evolved in some populations that confer insecticide resistance to these mosquitoes. So the flow of insecticide resistance alleles into a population can cause an increase in fitness for those individuals. Evolution by natural selection involves both chance and sorting. So this is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. So new genetic variations arise by chance, right? Those mutations are random, but beneficial alleles are sorted and favored by natural selection. So that results in adaptive evolution or an increase in the frequency of alleles that improve fitness. All right. So going back to this, because remember, you can't just say this unless you can explain it. So phrases struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are misleading because they imply direct competition among individuals. Sometimes individuals aren't directly competing. It's more about reproductive success. So who is able to survive and reproduce, because that is the whole goal, right? Is to produce offspring that are viable so that those offspring then also survive and reproduce. So relative fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. All right. There's 3 modes for natural selection. So those 3 modes are directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. So directional selection, think of it as it's moving, the population is moving in one direction or the other. It favors individuals at one end of the phenotypic range. Disruptive favors individuals at both extremes. And then stabilizing, it like stabilizes the curve or like smushes it in. So it favors the intermediate variants. Directional selection is when an extreme phenotype is favored and the distribution curve shifts in that direction. So this can occur when a population is adapting to a changing environment. So you can see our initial distribution of individuals, this is dealing with the horses. So you can see or remember horses were tiny, they were little itty bitty horsies. And then through time, the body size shifted. So this would be directional selection. So body size shifted to the extreme of being taller. This also happened with the peppered moth, right? Shifted from the variation of light and dark to dark phenotype. Disruptive selection, this is when the extreme phenotypes of both extremes are favored. So then we end up with two distinctly different phenotypes in the population. So banding patterns of snails. You can see here's our initial distribution. We kind of had a wide range of banding pattern, and then over time, we get like a dark banding pattern and a light banding pattern. So that would be disruptive. Stabilizing is when the intermediate phenotype is favored. So stabilizing selection example is with birds laying eggs. So robins typically lay 4 eggs. Larger clutches, that's just what they call the amount of eggs, may result in malnourished chicks, right? If there's too many chicks, the mama bird can't feed them all. Smaller clutches may result in no viable offspring. So if there's not enough eggs, those may not mature and develop into adult birds. So after natural selection, this very close range of about 4 eggs happens. So you can see here's all of them together, just so that we can see the example. Our original population, let's just say we're talking about fur color and mice. If we're talking about directional selection, they would shift to one extreme. So the mice may get darker fur. Disruptive, we would just have the 2 extreme phenotypes of very light fur color and very dark fur color. Stabilizing, we would just see that intermediate tan color mouse. All right, striking adaptations have arisen by natural selection. So for example, certain octopus can change color rapidly for camouflage, or the jaws of snakes allow them to swallow prey larger than their heads. So kind of crazy how they have developed that trait. All right, natural selection increases the frequency of alleles that enhance survival and reproduction. It occurs as the match between an organism and its environment increases. And because the environment can change, adaptive evolution is a continuous dynamic process. So again, genetic drift and gene flow don't consistently lead to adaptive evolution. They can increase or decrease the match between an organism and its environment. All right, last thing we're going to talk about is sexual selection. So it's natural selection for mating success. So it can result in sexual dimorphism. So di is like 2. So sexual dimorphism is marked differences between the sexes in secondary sexual characteristics. We see this a lot in birds, so that the male is a lot showier. So here's a peacock, right? Has all these bright feathers, they're bright blue. Okay, this is the peahen. So that's a female, and you can see she's just very plain. 2 types of sexual selections. Intra is within. So this is competition among individuals of one sex. So intra is within, so one sex, so males for mates. So this is like elk fighting, right, over a mate, or for territory. Inter, so inter, I think of it, the E is in here. So this is between, because between has an E. So intersexual selection is like mate choice. So this occurs when individuals of one sex, which is usually the females, are choosy and selecting their mates. And then this is why male showiness occurs. So that can increase a male's chances of attracting a female, but they're a little bit more obvious. So it might actually decreases his chance of survival because a lot of times they do have those bright colors. All right. So I think we're going to skip through, the rest of this. There is heterozygous advantage that occurs when heterozygotes have a higher fitness than both homozygotes. So an example here is sickle cell allele causes a mutation in hemoglobin. So if there's 2 alleles, that causes sickle cell disease. But if they're heterozygous, if they just have one allele, it actually helps those individuals be resistant to malaria. So there is a advantage there. Okay, and we're kind of circling back to a lot of these points, but they are important, so that's why I want to say them again. So selection can act only on existing variations, so that variation has to be there first. Evolution is limited by what has happened. Adaptations are often compromises. So it's not, there is no fixed direction. It's not trying to create a perfect structure. It's just chance, natural selection, and the environment are interacting. All right, hope that helps. See you guys.